So we are starting this new series. We are back in the Gospels, as is a part of our pattern, our tradition here, where we do Gospels in the spring, then something from the rest of the New Testament in the summer, and then the Old Testament in the autumn. And we're looking at parables. And Steve has done a good job already of telling you exactly summarising my sermon nicely in a couple of sentences, so I don't need to do any more. There is a danger of people that stand at the front and preach mini sermons, is that they might end up on the preaching team, as Mika has found out already. So just beware, Steve. If you want to preach, that's fine. I can arrange it. Now, when we're back in the Gospels. I was looking at our website this week, just kind of updating it, making sure it's all nothing there that's not supposed to be there anymore. And one of the things it says is we don't assume anyone knows anything about the Bible. We think the Bible is important. We teach the Bible, but we don't assume anyone knows anything about it at all. So I say we're back in the Gospels, but what are the Gospels? If you've got a Bible in front of you and you open it at the index page, you'll see that the Bible is split in two, an Old Testament and a New Testament. Old Testament is before Jesus, New Testament is kind of Jesus and on. And the Gospels are the first four books in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to slightly different audiences. So they are telling the story of Jesus, his life and his death, his resurrection. They're telling it from slightly different angles, so it's the same story, but four different tellings from slightly different perspectives. The word gospel comes from an Old English word that means good news or good story. So it is the good news about Jesus. If you've read Matthew, Mark, or Luke, you will have no doubt come across many of Jesus' parables. But if you've never read the Gospels, you may still have come across some of Jesus' parables. Some of them are very famous, things like the parable of the Good Samaritan. You might have heard about that one. So what is a parable? Well, the English word parable is just simply a Greek word, parable, written in English letters. And so it's just what we call a transliteration. In Greek, a parable was simply a short story that was told to illustrate a moral or spiritual lesson. So when I'm doing assemblies in primary school, if I'm doing anything on the parables, I will simply define a parable as a story with a point. And so that doesn't necessarily cover everything that we might want to say about parables, but it's a pretty good place to start. And so Jesus tells these stories, and when Jesus tells the story, he's doing so in order to make a point. He's doing so in order to teach something. And so whenever we read a parable, what we need to be asking ourselves is, what is the point? What is Jesus trying to teach? What am I supposed to be learning? What is this story supposed to be saying to me? How is it supposed to shape my life? And as we work through this series, we will see that some of the parables are a lot easier to understand than others. Some of the parables, like the one that we are looking at today, kind of Jesus gives us the point. So it's given to us in the Gospels. Whereas there are other parables that you kind of read and you think, what on earth was that about? What point was Jesus trying to make there? The Bible was written to be meditated on. And so when you read parts of the Bible, it's designed in such a way that that's supposed to trigger thoughts from other parts of the Bible. That's one of the reasons why we think here it's important to look at the Old Testament, because often the stuff that we're reading in the New Testament is supposed to be triggering other passages and stories from the Old Testament. A lot of the New Testament writers, a lot of the New Testament is shaped by an understanding of the Old Testament. And so when we read the parables, we are supposed to think about them. We're supposed to meditate on them. We're supposed to mull them over. Jesus left us stories. He didn't leave us bullet points. And so one of the things that we will hopefully be able to do over the course of this term is to spend some time meditating on the parables during the week. They're short enough that you can pretty easily remember them, not necessarily word for word, but you get the general idea. And so you can be prayerfully mulling over them when you're in the car, when you're shopping, when you're at home, when you're going for a walk, when you're having a coffee. And one of the powers of a story is that it continues to speak to us now. It's not stuck in the first century. It's not that Jesus gave us a bullet point that applied if you were a first century Christian, but obviously no longer applies today. And so the stories continue to speak. They continue to be meaningful to us today. And so we need to be spending some time reflecting on this story, asking what is the point? What was Jesus trying to say to his original audience? What is Jesus trying to say to me today? And so I'm just going to share with you a few reflections that I've had as I've mulled over the parable of the wise and the foolish builder, with the expectation that you will go away and that you will meditate on the story and you will invite the Holy Spirit to talk to you through the parable and for God to speak to you in that way. And so we have this very simple story in which Jesus is comparing two kinds of people. First of all, you've got those people that hear his words and then do them. And he says those people are like a wise builder. And then you've got another kind of person who is a person that hears Jesus' words but doesn't do them. And Jesus says they're like a foolish builder. So first person is the wise builder, is like someone who builds a house on rock with the foundations that stay, which means that the whole thing is intact when the storm comes. The second person is the kind of person who builds a house on sand, and so when the storm comes, the house falls down. And so the point is obvious from this passage. Jesus is wanting us to be people who don't just listen to his words, we put them into practice. And this is a message that comes elsewhere in the Bible in a variety of different ways. It's no good just hearing what Jesus said. It's no good just reading the Bible. It's no good just watching famous preachers on YouTube. It's no good just coming to church. We need to put it into practice. Many of us will have spent a lot of time last year in the Sermon on the Mount. And so you will be aware that this parable comes at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is a passage of Jesus' teaching, which is in Matthew 5, 6 and 7, and it concludes with the parable that we've just read. Luke also has this parable, slightly different wording, but the parable is basically the same, and that comes in Luke chapter 6 at the end of Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus has had this extended period of teaching, Matthew 5, 6 and 7, and he then warns the crowd that just listening to me is no good at all. You need to put all the things I've been saying to you into practice. For those of you who like homework, I would invite you to do a word study on the words wise and foolish in the Bible. Jesus was Jewish, his audience was Jewish, and these words wise and foolish are theologically loaded from the Old Testament. They're not just empty words. Jesus' audience, these words would have been already filled with all sorts of meaning from the Old Testament. And so have a look and see what the Old Testament has to say about the wise and about the foolish. If you want to know how to do that, then you can either speak to me later or you can head over to a new section on our church website. You'll find it under the resource menu, either on your app, on the phone, or on the computer, the resource menu, and it's a page that's headed Helpful Links. At the top of that page, there are a number of links to the Bible Project, including a link to their video on parables. So if you want to see what the Bible Project have to say about parables, it's about 5 minutes in length. Head over to that page and click the links. Then a bit further down, there are a couple of links to the Step Bible and Bible Gateway, both free resources that enable you to search the whole of the Bible. And so you say go on to Bible Gateway, you type in wise, you press search, and it will give you a list of all the verses in the Bible that contain the word wise. And then you can start digging and going down a whole variety of rabbit holes to your heart's content. Also on our YouTube channel, if you are subscribed to our YouTube channel, we've got a series of Taking It Further videos, and episode 7 of that is a video called How to Do a Word Study, and it takes you through step by step how to do a word study using either Bible Gateway or the Step Bible. Now you might be sat there glazing over thinking that sounds like a lot of work. I really can't be bothered, life's too short, I've got too much to be getting on with to be doing word searches on the Old Testament. But if that was your thoughts as I was speaking, I would like to just share a word of caution with you. One of the things that I've been reflecting on as I've read and meditated on this parable is that it takes a lot more work to build a house with foundations than it does to build a house without foundations. It takes a lot more work to live as someone who is wise than it does to live like a fool. A fool wants the end results, but is not prepared to put in the work. They want a quick fix, but they will sooner or later discover that there are no quick fixes. And so however much we might wish that it wasn't the case, the truth is that being a follower of Jesus requires hard work. It requires discipline. It requires sacrifice. It will be costly. It's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And it's never going to happen just by itself. You will never become more like Jesus by accident. It needs to be intentional, it needs to be disciplined, and it takes effort on our part. Another thing that I was reflecting on as I was thinking about this parable of the wise and the foolish builders was that both of these completed houses would have looked the part. You can kind of imagine a cartoon where you've got these two builders are building, and when they finished, both their houses look the same. One of them has been built much more quickly, much more easily, much cheaper than the other one, but they are both there, and on the surface they look identical. You can imagine a scene where the foolish builder has his house complete and he's sat by the pool sipping a drink, whilst the wise builder is barely above ground level. He spent all his time digging around, digging a hole in the ground, and now he's maybe got 3 layers of bricks up, and the other guy's sat by his swimming pool relaxing and taking it easy. And they both look great. The houses both look great until the storm hits. And both houses are hit by the same storm. Jesus deliberately uses the same language for both of them. The rain comes down, the streams rise, and the winds blew and beat against the house. And the house on the rock remains firm. The house on the sand falls with a great crash. And as I've been reflecting on this parable, for me it's particularly relevant for us as a church in this particular season that we are going through. There is this reminder that just because you are a follower of Jesus, it doesn't mean you're going to escape the storms of life. The storms hit whether we're wise or whether we are foolish. Earlier on in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus reminded us that God's physical blessings within creation, the sun, the rain, things that are experienced by everyone, whether we are wise or whether we are foolish. And so just because we are going through a storm, we should not doubt God's love for us. Again, earlier on in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus told his disciples that you will face many troubles. And the way that the Bible talks about hardships, talks about troubles, talks about storms, the way that the Bible talks about these things was in a direct contrast to the prevailing worldviews of the day. If you were going through a hardship, or you were going through a trouble, or you were going through a storm, many within the various cultures in the first century, they'd have taken it as a sign you've displeased the gods. The gods are angry with you. You need to find out what it is that you've done, and you need to appease the gods, and then this storm will pass. But in this story, Jesus teaches us something very different. The two houses can look exactly the same on the surface, but it's only when the storm hits that we discover whether it's built on rock or on sand. I've said this many times before, and I will keep on saying it, that from my own personal experience, there are things that I have been through that I would not want to go through again. But those experiences, those storms, those batterings, they have encouraged me to know that this house is built on the rock. They have shaped me into the person that I am now. And so whilst we don't pray for the storm, when the storm hits, it reveals the quality of the foundation that we have been building on. We want a house that stands when the storm hits. And so we need to be building on the rock. Jesus has been warning his disciples, again, just in the previous section in the Sermon on the Mount, about false prophets and about false disciples. And he says that you will know them by their fruits. And so part of it is, how do these people respond in the storm? Is their house left standing, or has it all been blown away? That is an indicator of whether they are a false or a true prophet, a false or true disciple. Another thought that I had, which again ties in with some of the thoughts that come earlier in the Sermon on the Mount, is that the difference between these two houses is all below the surface. They look the same, but the differences are below the surface. You can't see it just from looking from the outside. The difference is underground. And a lot of what Jesus has been saying in the Sermon on the Mount is about the inner life, about the stuff that you can't see. It's about our attitudes, it's about our motives, it's about our thoughts, it's about our hearts, it's about our minds. It's about the stuff that people cannot see on the outside. And so Jesus goes through in the Sermon on the Mount, and just to pick out a few of them, he says it's not about murder. The important thing is about, do you hold on to anger in your heart? It's not about adultery, but it's about what stories do you allow to play out in your mind. It's about loving your enemies and not hating them. It's about not doing things to impress others. It's about trusting God. It's about what's on the inside, what the stuff that people don't see. And I think this parable ties in with what Jesus has been saying. For those of you that want even more homework, then the image of God as rock, particularly in the Old Testament, will be time well spent. We started with a few verses from Psalm 62, and there are many, many, many examples that we could have picked where it talks about God being our rock. God is our rock, God is our refuge, God is our strength, God is our fortress. So how do we build on the rock? Well, Jesus is quite clear. It's about not just listening, but it's about doing. It's about putting it into practice. It's about obeying what Jesus said, putting what he taught into practice. Spend time with Jesus, listen to Jesus, and then obey. Become like Jesus as we allow the Holy Spirit to mould us into the people that he wants us to be. Let's pray.